In Magic the Gathering, the main thing that creatures can do is attack and block. Most creatures can do those things, no questions asked, but some creatures require you to meet some sort of requirement in order for them to be able to attack. This is typically introduced as a downside on a creature that is super efficient and powerful for the cost, as it helps balance out a card's power if it's not always capable of doing one of the main things that creatures are supposed to be able to do. Those are exactly the kind of creatures we're going to look at in this video. By the way, thanks to Braden for suggesting this MTG top 10 in the comments. If you've got a top 10 idea for me, let me know and I just might make it. Anyway, to be eligible for this list, a creature had to only be able to attack once you achieve some sort of requirement. I also chose to include creatures that can't attack alone, as that's effectively an attack requirement too. In all, there are 73 such cards in Magic, and in this video we'll look at the 10 conditional attackers that'll have the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like the Spotlight series. At number 10, it's Patchwork Beastie. For 1 green mana, it's a 3/3 artifact creature and it mills a card at the beginning of your upkeep. One of the best ways to design a conditional attacker is to have that conditional attacker be capable of helping you meet its condition, and that's what we have going on here, and with many of the cards that made the list. So the Beastie can only attack or block if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, but that mill trigger helps you get there. This does mean it's kind of non-existent on the board, apart from its mill trigger for a turn or two, but the decks that play the Beastie are very interested in getting value out of the graveyard, so that trigger itself can be valuable for reasons other than Patchwork Beastie. Furthermore, if you're playing a deck that's interested in the Delirium mechanic more broadly, the Beastie is nice because it can get you halfway there all on its own. Its top 8s have all come in Gruul and Jund aggro decks in both Standard and Pioneer. These decks feature a hefty Delirium theme and can quickly reach Delirium with the help of powerful aggressive creatures that let you discard cards like Fear of Missing Out. However, of late the Beastie has slowed down quite a bit and there's a good chance of it dropping off of this list in the future. At number 9, it's Vantress Gargoyle. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a massive 5/4 flying artifact creature, but it can't attack unless the defending player has 7 or more cards in their graveyard, and it also can't block unless you have 4 or more cards in your hand. It can help you load the graveyard of both players by tapping to mill 1 card for each player, so if you hold on to lots of cards and you're good at milling, this becomes a very scary 2-drop, both because it can do tons of damage in a hurry, and it can set up your other mill stuff. Most of its top 8s came when it was in Standard, where it was appearing in mill decks alongside Soaring Thought Thief and Thieves Guild Enforcer. Like them, it could both mill and pay you off for doing it. These decks use mill to make their creatures better, and usually won the game by attacking once they had milled enough cards to power up the board. It's seen more sporadic play in Pioneer, where it's occasionally played alongside the graveyard-loving Arclight Phoenix, and it's also got a top 8 from a modern mill deck, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2021. At number 8, it's Goblin Goon. It's 3 generic and a red for a 6/6, but it can't attack unless you control more creatures than defending player, and it can't block unless you control more creatures than the attacking player. The good news for the Goon is that he's a goblin, and goblin decks rarely have fewer creatures than the opponent, so the downside rarely comes up. Unsurprisingly, the Goon put up top 8s in goblin decks and blocked Standard and Extended between 2003 and 2005. These decks ran Goblin Warchief, and making the Goon cheaper and hasty was pretty frightening, and there were plenty of other Goblin payoffs in those decks too. However, Goblin Goon hasn't managed to hang on and continue to see play in today's Goblin decks, and it doesn't have any top 8 since 2005. At number 7, I've got 2 cards because they are functionally identical. Mogg Conscripts and Goblin Cohort. The only difference between them is that the Cohort has the warrior creature type while the Conscripts do not. The Conscripts are the legitimate number 7, while the Cohort would have been in between Vantress Gargoyle and Goblin Goon. Both of them are goblins that cost 1 red mana for a 2/2, and both of them can only attack if you've cast a creature spell that turn. As with Goblin Goon, this is a downside that goblin decks can overcome relatively easily, as they just love curving out with goblins. And if you can do that, these are both 1 mana 2/2s that can get aggressive curves started in a big way. The Conscripts saw play in block-constructed aggro decks, and both of them have been played, often together, in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. There they tend to be played in Goblin and Red aggro decks. Both of them are still seeing some play in Pauper and could move higher on the list in the future. At number 6, it's Topiary Stomper. For 1 generic and 2 green, it's a 4/4 with Vigilance, and when it enters, you search up a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. However, it can't attack or block unless you control 7 or more lands. So this is a big body with rampant growth attached to it, and while if you play it on turn 3, it's probably not going to be able to immediately attack or block, the fact it grabs one of those lands for you does help you get there, and if you're running one ramp spell like this, there's a good chance you're running even more of them, and that's likely to get the Stomper going even more quickly. While in Standard, it was primarily played in ramp domain decks, which wanted to both ramp mana and quickly assemble lands of every basic land type to power up stuff like Herd Migration, and the Stomper could definitely help you get there. It's also seen a bit of play in Pioneer, primarily in mono green decks, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2024. At number 5, it's Ketramose, the New Dawn. He's an Amonkhet god, though he's from Aether Drift and not an actual Amonkhet set, but it is designed the same way the gods from actual Amonkhet are. That is to say, it can't attack or block unless you meet some requirement. For 1 generic, a white and a black, it's a 4/4 with Menace, Lifelink, and Indestructible, but it can't attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile, and whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Ketramose does not come with a built-in way to help you reach his requirement so he can attack and block, but that's okay because the payoff for exiling cards when he's around is absolutely massive. Drawing a card every time you exile something or your opponent exiles something and eventually turning into a hard-to-block indestructible creature that's also going to gain you a bunch of life is a powerful combination. These days, there are tons of ways to exile cards from both the graveyard and the battlefield, almost incidentally, including lots of removal spells and mechanics like Warp and Transforming Sagas. Ketramose has only seen a bit of play in Standard and Pioneer control decks. These decks run removal that can trigger Ketramose like Seam Rip and Ride's End. Some of the nastier things these decks can do is cast either Deadly Cover-Up or the End, which are a sweeper and spot removal spell respectively, but both come with the ability to exile a ton of cards single-handedly. Deadly Cover-Up comes with Collect Evidence, which will exile cards, and then it lets you search your opponent's library, hand, and graveyard for cards to exile depending on what died. Modern is where Ketramose has seen the most play though. There he can be played alongside Psychic Frog and Emperor of Bones, both of which are incredibly powerful cards that see tons of play in the format anyway, and they're both really good at quickly exiling multiple things and generating value while also pressuring your opponent even more. Even Legacy isn't entirely safe from this god. He's going to continue to rack up top 8s, and he's seeing so much play in multiple formats that it's very likely to move all the way up to the number 3 spot in the near future. At number 4, it's Rhonas, the Indomitable, the second consecutive Amonkhet god on the list. And this one comes from original Amonkhet. It costs 2 generic and a green, it's a 5/5 with Death Touch and Indestructible, and you can also pay 2 generic and a green to give another target creature +2/+0 and trample until end of turn, but Rhonas needs you to have another creature with power 4 or greater to be able to attack or block. Good news is its own activated ability is often enough to make something big enough for Rhonas to be able to rumble. In Standard, Rhonas saw play in decks that had no problem meeting the requirement. This included Gruul and Temur Energy decks, as well as +1/+1 counter decks. Rhonas has also been played in Pioneer Devotion and various green aggro decks in the format. He's even seen some play in modern creature toolbox decks that run things like Collected Company and Court of Calling to grab creatures that are particularly useful in a given situation. Rhonas has been run as a singleton copy in some versions of those decks, where it can be searched up when the board is already in a great place for Rhonas. Rhonas is still seeing occasional play in Pioneer, but it's putting up top 8s way too slowly to outpace Ketramose, which is a much newer card and is already within a single point of Rhonas. At number 3, it's Lambholt Pacifist. For 1 generic and a green, it's a 3/3 that can't attack unless you control a creature with power 4 or greater, and because she's also a werewolf, at the beginning of each upkeep, she checks to see if any spells were cast last turn, and if they weren't, she transforms into Lambholt Butcher, a 4/4, without the downside. That 4/4 also checks to see if 2 or more spells were cast on the previous turn, in which case it turns back into the Pacifist. One of the nice things about this condition is that the Pacifist counts herself, so if you buff its power to 4, it can attack. And while it wasn't Standard, the Pacifist was played in decks that had no problem doing that, and when that's the case, you've got a super strong 2-drop without any meaningful downside. Decks pulled this off with cards like Dromoka's Command or Thalia's Lieutenant, but it hasn't seen play anywhere since rotating out of Standard, so it's just going to lose ground on the list. At number 2, it's Hazoret the Fervent, the third and final Amonkhet god on the list. For 3 generic and a red, it's an indestructible 5/4 with haste, but it can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand. You can also pay 2 generic and a red and discard a card to have it do 2 damage to each opponent. So Hazoret can help you meet its requirement by letting you turn cards into damage and then smashing in for a big hit itself. Hazoret has seen multi-format success, and it's usually played in aggro decks, which often have an empty hand by the time they play their 4-drop anyway. This whole package makes for a very aggressive creature that can hit very hard with hasty, difficult to block damage, and can finish the opponent off with its ability. Hazoret was a heavily played card in standard red-based aggro decks, and was certainly one of the defining cards in that standard format. It's also seen play in other formats, although the only other format where it's been really consistent is Pioneer, where it's been played in lots of different red decks since the format was created. It is notable that it was seeing play in mono-red mice decks in the format, but the banning of Heartfire Hero earlier this month has caused Hazoret to see less play, but it's one of the best cards for mono-red in the format, and mono-red is almost always a thing in Pioneer, even if it is going to change a little bit. It's also seen occasional play in modern decks focused on discard, like Hollow One, and most of its success in Legacy has come in mono-red prison decks that aim to lock the game down with things like Chalice of the Void and Ensnaring Bridge, and Hazoret provides a deck with a win condition with its direct damage ability, while also assuring that your hand stays empty. I think eventually Hazoret will pass the number 1 card on the list. For now though, that number 1 card is Lovestruck Beast. For 2 generic and a green, it's a 5/5, but it can't attack unless you control a 1/1 creature. That does mean he can still block with that big body, but Lovestruck Beast is really good because he's also got an adventure called Heart's Desire. It's a sorcery, and when you cast it, you exile Lovestruck Beast, and you can cast it as Lovestruck Beast from exile. And Heart's Desire synergizes perfectly with Lovestruck Beast because it makes that 1/1 human. That makes the beast very likely to be capable of attacking, and it also means this 1 card can cover 2 points on your curve, which is pretty sweet. So fulfilling this requirement isn't actually that hard, and the fact that this 1 card gives you both a 5/5 and a 1/1 is a really good rate. The beast gained a ton of points during its time in Standard, largely as a result of basically always having a good home in the format. This included a variety of more traditional aggro decks that have green in them, like Selesnya, Gruul, and so forth, as well as more adventure-centric decks that played things like Lucky Clover and Edgewall Innkeeper to make the beast even better. It was also really good alongside the Great Henge, as it gave you a very cheap creature that could make that powerful artifact a lot cheaper. It's also seen lots of play in Pioneer, showing up in most green aggro decks in the format, like Gruul and Mono Green, and it's also found some success in that format's adventure decks, but it only has a single top 8 in the last year, so it's slowed down significantly lately, and I think it's very likely Hazoret overtakes the beast in the relatively near future. So those are the top 10 conditional attackers in Magic. Do you like big, efficient creatures that require you to jump through hoops to attack with them? If so, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at mechanics, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.